Chapter 15, Section 2. Ideas that shaped Darwin's thinking. If Darwin had lived a century earlier, he might have done little more than think about the questions raised during his travels. But Darwin's voyage came during one of the most exciting periods in the history of Western science. Explorers were traversing the globe, and great thinkers were beginning to challenge established views about the natural world. Darwin was powerfully influenced by the work of these scientists, especially those who were studying the history of Earth. In turn, he himself greatly changed the thinking of many scientists and non-scientists. Some people, however, found Darwin's ideas too shocking to accept. To understand how radical Darwin's thoughts appeared, you must understand a few things about the world in which he lived. Most Europeans in Darwin's day believed that the earth and all its forms of life had been created only a few thousand years ago. Since the original creation, they concluded neither the planets nor its living species had changed. A robin, for example, was always looked and behaved as robins had in the past. Rocks and major geological features were thought to have been produced suddenly by catastrophic events that humans rarely, if ever, witnessed. By the time Darwin set sail, numerous discoveries had turned up important pieces of evidence. A rich fossil record, including the example in Figure 15-5, was challenging that traditional view of life. In light of such evidence, some scientists even adjusted their beliefs to include not one but several periods of creation. Each of these periods, they contended, was preceded by a catastrophic event that killed off many forms of life. At first, Darwin may have accepted these beliefs, but he began to realize that much of what he had observed did not fit neatly into the view of unchanging life. Slowly, after studying many scientific theories at his time, Darwin began to change his thinking dramatically. An ancient, changing Earth. During the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists examined Earth in great detail. They gathered information suggesting that the Earth was very old and had changed slowly over time. Two scientists who formed important theories based on this evidence were James Hutton and Charles Lyell. Hutton and Lyell helped scientists recognize that Earth is many millions of years old, and the processes that changed Earth in the past are the same processes that operate in the present. Hutton and geological change. In 1795, the geologist James Hutton published a detailed hypothesis about the geological forces that have shaped Earth. Hutton proposed that the layers of rock, such as those shown in Figure 15-6, formed very slowly. Also, some rocks are moved up by forces beneath Earth's surface. Others are buried, and still others are pushed up from the sea floor to form mountain ranges. The resulting rocks, mountains, and valleys are then shaped by a variety of natural forces, including rain, wind, heat, and cold temperatures. Most of these geological processes operate extremely slow, often over millions of years. Hutton, therefore, proposed that Earth had to be much more than a few thousand years old. Lyles' Principles of Geology. Just before the Beagle set sail, Darwin had been given the first volume of geologist Charles Lyles' book. Principles of Geology. Lyles stressed that scientists must explain past events in terms of processes that they can actually observe, since processes that shaped the Earth millions of years earlier continued in the present. Volcanoes release hot lava and gases now, just as they did in the ancient Earth. Erosion continues to carve out canyons, just as it did in the past. Lyle's work explained how awesome geological features could be built up or torn down over long periods of time. Lyell helped Darwin appreciate the significance of geological phenomena that had been observed. Darwin had witnessed a spectacular volcanic eruption. Darwin wrote about an earthquake that had lifted a stretch of rocky shoreline, with mussels and other animals attached to it, more than 3 meters above its previous position. He noted that fossils of marine animals were displaced many feet above sea level. Darwin then understood how geological processes could have raised these rocks from the sea floor to a mountaintop. This understanding of geology influenced Darwin in 2 ways. First, Darwin asked himself, if the Earth could change over time, might life change as well? Second, he realized that it would have taken many, many years for life to change in the way he suggested. This would have been possible only if the Earth was extremely old. Lamarck's evolution hypotheses. The French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was among the first scientists to recognize that living things have changed over time, and that all species were descended from other species. He also realized that organisms were somehow adapted to their environments. In 1809, the year that Darwin was born, Lamarck published his hypotheses. Lamarck proposed that by selective use or disuse of organs, organisms acquire or lost certain traits during their lifetime. These traits could then be passed on to their offspring. Over time, these processes led to change in a species. Tendency towards perfection. Lamarck proposed that all organisms have an innate tendency towards complexity and perfection. As a result, they are continually changing and acquiring features that help them live more successfully in their environments. In Lamarck's view, for instance, the ancestors of the birds acquired an urge to fly. Over many generations, birds kept trying to fly, and their wings increased in size and became more suited to flying. Use and disuse. Because of this tendency towards perfection, Lamarck proposed that organisms could alter the size or shape of particular organs by using their bodies in new ways. For example, by trying to use their front limbs for flying, birds could eventually transform those limbs into wings. Conversely, if a winged animal did not use its wings, an example of disuse, the wings would decrease in size over generations and finally disappear. Inheritance of acquired traits. Like many biologists of the time, Lamarck thought that acquired characteristics could be inherited. For example, if during its lifetime an animal somehow altered a body structure leading to longer legs or fluffier feathers, it would pass that change on its offspring. By this reasoning, if you spent much of your life lifting weights to build muscles, your children would inherit big muscles too. Evaluating Lamarck's hypotheses. Lamarck's hypotheses of evolution, illustrated in figure 15.7, are incorrect in several ways. Lamarck, like Darwin, did not know how traits are inherited. He did not know that an organism's behavior has no effect on its heritable characteristics. However, Lamarck was one of the first to develop a scientific hypothesis of evolution and to realize that organisms are adapted to their environments. He paved the way for the work of later biologists. Population growth. Another important influence on Darwin came from the English economist Thomas Malthus. In 1798, Malthus published a book in which he noted that babies were being born faster than people were dying. Malthus reasoned that if the human population continued to grow unchecked, sooner or later there would be an insufficient living space and food for everyone. The only forces he observed that worked against this growth were war, famine, and disease. Conditions in certain parts of the 19th century England, illustrated in 15-8, reinforced Malthus' somewhat pessimistic view of the human condition. When Darwin read Malthus' work, he realized that this reasoning applied even more strongly to plants and animals than it did to humans. Why? Because humans produce far fewer offspring than most other species do. A mature maple tree can produce thousands of seeds in a single summer, and one oyster can produce millions of eggs each year. If all the offspring of almost any species survived for several generations, they would overrun the world. Obviously, this has not happened because continents are not covered with maple trees and oceans are not filled with oysters. The overwhelming majority of a species' offspring die. Further, only a few of those offspring that survive succeed in reproducing. What causes the death of so many individuals? What factor or factors determine which ones survive and reproduce, and which do not? Answer to these questions became central to Darwin's explanation of evolutionary change. Some key takeaways from this chapter. All right, number one, I need you to understand that in Darwin's time, people thought of the earth as being very young, like thousands of years old, and also that every living thing on earth was created by a divine God. Okay, so it was ridiculous, or actually like blasphemy, okay, against the law, to say that something that a species evolved from or had a common ancestor. So they all believed that everything that was on earth was put forth by God. Okay, so that's what they believed, and that the earth was very young. But then, came these two scientists that influenced Darwin, with Hutton and Lyell, and they were the ones that talked about the earth being actually millions of years old, and the way they prove that or try to convince others of that is based on their observations of geology, of sediments and layers of rocks. They were able to see the different layers of rocks and how fossils were at the top of mountains, and they explain how this could be. So these two scientists were very important because they were convincing Darwin that the earth is super old. So therefore, if the earth can change over millions of years, then that kind of inspired him to think, well, maybe life can change during that time as well. Then he had Lamarck's work. He admired Lamarck because he was the first one to talk about living things changing over time. So instead of just God put us here and that's why we are who we are, he was the first one to talk about how living things can change over time and pass those traits onto their offspring. And so as you read those hypotheses, keep in mind that they were not correct, all right, because he didn't know about genes and DNA and so forth. And finally, the last person was Malthus, okay? Thomas Malthus. This guy right here influenced Darwin because he talked about living things, and if they reproduce too much, then eventually there wouldn't be enough resources to sustain the population. And Darwin looked at that work, and he realized that that's even more important for plants and animals because they produce so many offspring, or they have so much potential to produce offspring, but yet we don't not all the offspring make it. Not every seed gets planted and becomes a flower. Why is that? Right? Because of so that's super important, that there's population growth and it could be limited. And if the population grows too much, then eventually there might not be enough resources to sustain that population. So keep in mind that those four people were super important, and that they contributed to Darwin's thinking.